it's Tracy, and in this week's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this illustrated sketchbook mockup using Affinity Designer. Now, you can use this on your social media accounts or on your website as a fun and unique way of showing off your lettering work or illustrations like I have here with this bouquet I created. Or if you're into digital journaling, you can use it to create a nice background for your planner in GoodNotes or other annotation apps. Best of all, once you know how to create this, you can easily customize it. So if you wanted to, you could easily swap out the illustrations, you could change up the textures or colors and customize it to suit your needs. Even better, everything you need to create this is already either in Designer or easily accessible right from Designer. So you don't need to buy any textures or brushes. I'm going to show you how to create this with everything you already have at your fingertips. Now, I'm using the iPad version of the app. If you're using the desktop version, the process is the same. So as long as you know where the tools are, you can follow along with no problem. So we have a lot to cover in this tutorial. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I have a particular color palette I'm going to be using for my illustrated sketchbook. If you want to use the exact color palette I've used, I've provided the link to the AF palette file for your desktop version or the PNG so that you can sample the colors. They can both be found in the downloads link in the description. And in order to access it, you're going to need a password, which I'm going to put up on the screen now. Okay, on the downloads page, you'll see two videos. One will show you how to pull this into your iPad version. The other is going to show you how to pull it into the desktop version. They are different. And once you have that up and ready, we're ready to get started. Or again, use your own colors and your own textures. It's totally up to you. So let's go ahead and start creating our notebook. Okay, I've set up a new document here and mine is set to 8 by 10 at 144 DPI. I don't plan to print this, only use it on the web, so I'm not worried about the size of my document. If you do plan to print yours, you need to make sure that your original document is set to the largest size you plan to print. The reason for that is while flat vectors are infinitely scalable, vectors that have any sort of raster elements attached to this, and in this case it would be the texture, are not infinitely scalable. So if you do plan to print it, you just need to keep in mind the largest size you plan to print and make sure you size your document accordingly. So I have this in place. I'm going to go ahead and start with my very background layer, and that would be the desktop that the notebook is sitting on. Now you can make yours whatever texture you'd like. If you recall from the beginning of the video, mine's actually a piece of wood. If you want yours granite, concrete, whatever, you're all going to find it in the same place. So we're going to go to the stock studio to find our texture. And my screen, I should note, is flipped for a left-handed person. So our icons might be on the other side from one another, but they work exactly the same. So let's go ahead and find the stock studio, which is this little, it looks like a little landscape photo. If you ever can't find anything, just hold your finger down on the question mark and labels will pop up. So I'll go ahead and tap on the stock studio. This gives you access to Unsplash, to Pixabay, and to Pexels. And these are three sites where you can find tons of free use, royalty-free images for reference photos as well as use in your work. So I'm going to use this to find the textures for this illustration. I'm going to use the Unsplash one. I'll just go ahead and type in wood texture and hit search, and that's going to pull up every image in Unsplash that applies to that particular search. Now, if I don't find what I want in here in Unsplash, I can go ahead and just tap across here at the top and it'll give me Pixabay and Pexels, but I actually know which one I already want to use. Now, there's a couple of things that I look for when I'm using a background texture. I want my main focus to be the sketchbook that I'm going to create. I don't want anything in the background that's going to draw the eye away from that. So I don't want anything that's too light or too dark. I also don't want anything that's got too much texture where it's going to become the main focus point. I do want something warm though. So I like this texture here. Again, choose whichever texture you'd like. I'm going to tap and hold and then release, and it's going to pull that texture into my document. So I'll go ahead and close the stock studio, and I'm just going to drag to size this. Now, normally, if you were going to print this, you need to make sure that you release it to get it set at the largest size you can. And then if you want to size down, you can go ahead and reselect it and size down, because the way Designer is, it pulls it in at whatever size the file is. However, if you drop it at a smaller size, you could run into pixelation. Again, I'm not planning to print this, so I'm not as worried about it. But if you do, just make sure that you place it large and then size it down. I'm just going to move this over. The majority of this is going to be covered by the sketchbook, but I still want to make sure I don't have any textures that are too much that are going to draw the eye. So I'll go ahead and release that. And we're all set with the background layer. Let's go ahead and start creating our notebook. Okay, we have our background in place. Let's go ahead and start creating our notebook. Now I'm going to go ahead and select a fill. I actually have this peach color selected. I'm not going to choose a stroke. I don't typically use a stroke unless there's a reason for it. So I just have a fill selected. I'm going to use my rectangle tool to do this, and I want to create a rounded rectangle. Now, if you're using the desktop version, there's a built-in rounded rectangle shape that you can use. If you're using the iPad version, there's not, but it's easy to create one. So I'll go ahead and select my rectangle tool. I'll just make sure the rectangle shape is selected, and I'm going to drag out a rectangle. Now I don't want it to be so large that it's covering the background, because then there's no point in having that there. I do want it large enough though that my illustration is going to show. I also want to make sure I'm leaving a little space to the left for the binder rings we're going to create. So I like this size. We may end up sizing it down, but we'll see. Now I need to create a rounded rectangle out of this, and in order to do that I need to be able to use the node tool on the four corners, but I can't right now because this is a shape, not a curve. You can only use nodes on curves. So I need to convert this, and I can do that either by going to the bottom here and tapping on two curves if it's showing, or if it's not, go to my edit menu and do it there. So I'm just going to go ahead and tap to curves. Now I can use my corner tool, which is one of the node tools, to change my four corners from sharp to rounded. So I want to go ahead and I'm going to drag across to select all four nodes, and they'll turn blue when they're selected. Go to my contextual menu at the bottom and change this to rounded. And then I'm just going to drag up and give this a slightly rounded edge. I don't want it to be sharp, but I don't want it to be too rounded, just a subtle curve to it. So that's my background part, the back of the sketchbook. Ultimately, we're going to have two of these. One's going to be the back part of the sketchbook, and the other is going to be the front that's just flipped around to the back. And I want to add some texture to this. I want it to be a cork texture. So I'm going to go to my stock studio. Now I actually already have the search up. Just go ahead and type in cork texture. I happen to like this one, but if you want to use a different one, you can flip through. Or you can add any texture you like, if you want burlap or what, canvas, whatever you'd like to look up. I'm gonna go ahead and use this one in the Pexels studio. So I'll tap and hold and release. And I'll go ahead and close the studio, grab my move tool, and I'm gonna rotate this. And when you hold your finger down while you rotate, it rotates in 15-degree angles. I'm gonna drag this up, size it up, and it's going to be larger than the original rectangle, and that's okay. I just want to go ahead and make it nice and large so you can see that texture. I want to clip this to this rectangle because right now, again, it's sitting on top of it. It's blocking the actual rectangle itself. So I want to go ahead and clip it so that you're seeing the original shape of the curve. So I'm just going to drag this layer down until I see the blue line going halfway across that layer. Make sure you don't keep your pencil over here. That's a completely different function. Keep your pencil or stylus to the right of the layer. And once you see the blue line across the middle of the layer, just release. And now it's clipped inside that original shape. So you're not seeing any overhang. I want to also change the blend mode of this because I want the cork texture, but I want that peach color to come through. So with it selected, I'll tap on these three dots, which takes me to the layer options for that layer. And you can see blend modes are here. Now you can either tap to get the full list, or you can tap through. Now I already know I'm going to use soft light for this or overlay, so I'm going to check out the two. I think I'll go ahead and use soft light and just drop it slightly. I'm just going to drop the opacity. I want the cork texture, but I don't want it to be overwhelming. So now I have that nice texture. I have the peach color coming through. I like how it plays off the warmth of the background. I'm going to go ahead and deselect that. I'm going to begin creating my paper, and then we're going to come back and begin building up the entire notebook. So let's go back to our rectangle tool and start creating the paper. Okay, I want to select this off-white color for my fill. That's going to be the paper color. Again, I have my rectangle tool selected, and I'm going to drag out a paper here. And I want it to be further to the left than the right. I do want the notebook to show because just like the background texture, if you can't see any of it, there's no point in it being there. So we do want to see a little bit of it. So now I need to add a shadow to this, because ultimately what we're going to do is duplicate this twice so that there's 3 of the same rectangle. And we want shadowing to give it that effect of being stacked. Let me go ahead and turn these off for a moment and show you the original one so you can see what I'm talking about. All right. If I zoom in here, we have 3 of the pieces of paper here. I've moved 2 of them out and I've set shadows under each, and that gives the impression of dimension upward. So we're going to do the same thing here. I'll turn these back on. So I'm going to go ahead and add an effect to this. With it selected, I'll go to my FX Studio, turn on outer shadow. Now, in order to be able to adjust the shadow, I need to tap on the header, and that gives me the contextual menu. I'm just going to drag this out for right now. I'm not going to adjust the radius or opacity. I just want the shadow there for right now so that I can easily see the difference between the 3 squares when I start duplicating this, and then I'll go back in and adjust it. So really, I'm just going to go ahead and drag it out so that I can see it. Now I'm going to go back to my layer and I'm going to duplicate this 3 times. So with it selected, I'll go to my edit menu, tap duplicate, edit, duplicate. That gives me 3 pieces of paper. You can do more if you'd like. I find 3 works just fine to show depth. And I'm going to go ahead and move the bottom 2 out slightly from the top one. So I'm going to select this second one. I'm going to grab my move tool so it's totally selected. I have a bounding box on there. And I'll go to my transform studio, and this is going to allow me to move it an exact amount rather than dragging out. You can do that if you want, but you'll end up spending a lot of time trying to get it just right. So I'm going to go ahead and use this X position because that is what shows how far left or right it is. So right now it's at 1.4 inches on the canvas and it's directly below that top one. I need to move it out slightly from that. So I'm going to tap. I'm going to keep the 1.4 in there and I'll add plus and just do 0.15. And that just moves it out slightly. I don't want it to be too much. I just want it to be a little bit. I'm going to go to my third one, select it with my move tool, go to my transform studio. Again, it's showing 1.4 inches because that's the original position. I'm going to do plus 0.3. So that's double what I did the last one. So now you can see they're all out from one another, but these shadows are really harsh and I don't want that. I want them to be much more subtle than that. Now I don't actually have to change all 3. I can change one of them, copy, and then paste it to the other 2. So I'm going to start with this top one. I'll go ahead and select it. Any of the effects that you do in this FX Studio are they can be adjusted at any point in time. They're non-destructive. So I'm just going to go ahead, tap outer shadow again. That's going to give me my contextual menu. And now I'm going to start playing around with the radius. Let me zoom in so you can see that. If I start dragging my radius up, you'll see the shadow start to blur. I'm going to drag it in a little bit. It's a little too far out. And I might drag the opacity down slightly. I just want a subtle shadow. I don't want anything too obvious because again, I don't want to drag the eye away from anything I'm putting on the paper itself. I'm going to go ahead and just knock that down a little bit. Now again, I don't need to then do the same thing to the other 2. I can go back to my layer and with it selected, go up to my edit menu and select copy. Now I'll tap on that second one, go to edit menu, and I want to tap paste FX. And you want to make sure that you're pasting FX and not just a regular paste. If I did that, it's going to paste another piece of paper. I just want the effect from it. So I'll do paste FX. Go to the third one, edit menu, paste effects. Now I have it under all 3 and we have what looks like papers sitting on top of one another. Now I'm going to do the same thing to my notebook. I actually want to I'll add that same effect. So I'm just going to go to the edit menu, paste effects. And now I want to duplicate that layer because I want it to look like the front cover is flipped behind and slightly behind the back cover. So I'll just, with it selected, go to my edit menu and tap duplicate. And now I have 2 of that curve. I'm going to select the bottom one and I'm just going to move it out myself. I'm not going to worry about using a formula or anything. I'm just going to drag up from here until it's where I want it. So I just moved it out slightly. It's not a lot. It's, again, just to give the impression of the front cover being behind the back and just peeking out, so it gives an impression of depth. All right, so one last thing I want to do here with this paper is I want to add a texture to my top paper to give it the impression, again, of it being paper. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. I'm going to go back into my Stock Studio, remove that search, and I'm going to type in paper texture. And let's see. I want to find something that has just enough grittiness, but not so much that, again, it's distracting. So it's hard to see on the video, I'm sure, but there's one that has a little bit of a paper speckling to it. So I'm gonna go ahead and select and place that. I'm going to, with my move tool, just move it in place. Again, I'm going to make it larger than the original rectangle. And then I'll drag and clip it to that top paper layer. I don't need to do it to all three because you can't see all three. I'm just going to drop that. Now I want the texture, but I don't want the white color. So I'm going to use my blend modes again and just tap through until I find a blend mode I like. And let's see. I think I'm probably going to end up using luminosity and just drop it down. So I'm getting this slight texture. I probably, under normal circumstances, would probably end up changing my texture, but I think this will be fine for what I'm doing. You can always change it. If you want to delete it, it's non-destructive. You can just delete the layer and start again, find a different texture until you find one that you like. Sometimes it's hit or miss, but this gives me enough of a paper texture. I just really want to give that hint of it. Okay, so we have our front cover, our back cover, and our 3 pages in cover. What we're still missing are our binder rings, so let's go ahead and begin creating those. Okay, I'm going to group this notebook together. So I've tapped on the first layer or the last layer, 2-finger tapped on the last. I'm going to go ahead and hit group. And I'm going to turn these 2 off for right now because I want you to be able to see what I'm creating. So we're going to create some binder rings. Now let me just, again, turn that original notebook back on so you can see how they look. What's going to ultimately give it the impression of being a binder ring is the light, the highlights and the shadows that we add, as well as the holes. So we're going to use a combination of our shape tool to add some highlights and the pixel persona with the airbrush to use to add some dark value to that. So let's go ahead and turn that off. You can make yours any color you'd like, gold, silver, rose gold. I'm going to make a kind of a pewter color one. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and I'm going to grab this basic gray that's in the quick colors and just drag out a rectangle. Now I'm making mine really large so you can see it. I make it kind of short but long. And again, I want this to be a rounded rectangle. So I'm going to go ahead and convert this to a curve. I'll go ahead and grab my corner tool, select all 4, change this to rounded, and I'm just going to drag up. And I want this to be a lot more rounded than the notebook itself was. All right. I'm going to grab my move tool, make this a little bit longer and maybe a little bit more short. We're going to create 1 binder ring, including the hole, and then we're going to duplicate it all the way down. That way everything looks uniform. So now I want to go ahead and add some highlights to this, and I'm going to use my ellipse tool for that. I'm going to deselect that. I want to select a color, so I'm just going to go ahead and choose this off-white color again. Grab my ellipse tool. I'm going to drag out 2 ellipses, and they're going to be up at the top here. They're going to be relatively narrow. And I'm actually just going to 2-finger tap and drag the second one down. Now I need to add a blur to this because right now this is very solid and it looks nothing like a highlight. I'm going to add a Gaussian blur to both. One is going to be a little bit more blurred than the other. So the top one, which is this bottom layer, I'm gonna go ahead and select it, hit Effects, turn on Gaussian blur, and then tap on the header so I get the contextual menu. And I'm just going to start dragging up. I just want it to be slightly blurred. So it's about 36 points. Or I'm sorry, 36 pixels. The second one is going to be a little bit more. So I'll go ahead and tap it, go into my effects menu, turn on Gaussian blur, tap it to get the contextual menu, And again, I'll go ahead and drag up. Now I want to make this a lot more. It's going to be about 79, 80. And I might move this down slightly, just so they're slightly separated. Okay, so there's our highlight. Now, one thing I do want to note that I didn't do yet, I want to make sure that both of these effects are, you turn on scale with object, because when I size this down, I don't want there to be an issue with the blur itself sizing funny. So just turn on scale with object on both of them. I'm also going to select both, and I'm going to clip them to the curve. And that way, if I change the background, you're not going to see any of that blur outside of this gray piece. So I have my highlights in place. Now I need to start adding some dark values to this. I'm going to use my pixel persona for that, and specifically use the airbrush. So let's go ahead and head on over there. All right, I'm gonna grab my pixel persona. I have my brush tool, my paintbrush tool selected, and I want to select a dark color. I'm going to start with this dark charcoal color that I have, and you can see it's changed the color down here. And I'm going to grab one of the built-in airbrushes. So I'm going to tap on the header here and choose sprays and spatters. That's where the airbrushes are. And I like airbrush 1. That's perfectly fine for what we're doing. And I'm just going to make it a little bit larger. I'm going to play with the size of the brush as well as the opacity as I go around. I want to add dark values all around the edges, but especially at the ends, and most especially at this end where it's going to go in the hole. So I'm just going to start running it. Oh, the first thing I want to do, always make sure that you select that layer. It's going to add a pixel layer automatically, and it's automatically going to clip it as long as you select that layer. I want to make sure that that's all inside. So I'm just going to run this along here. I'm going to run it along the top. So again, you can see it's adding some dark values to that. I am going to drop my opacity here at the bottom. And I want to run the airbrush in here just a little bit, just to give it, again, some dark values. We're going to drop the opacity of the overall layer. So right now it's a little harsh, but I'm not worried about that. And that's a little too much. I'm going to go ahead and I want to grab a much darker color, and you can't see it, I'm sure, on the video, but I have a lot darker gray here. I'm going to bring my opacity back up, and I want to start hitting the edges, because in order to make it look curved, the edges need to be a lot darker than the rest of it, and especially this side where it would be going into the hole. Now again, this is super dark, but I'm not worried about it because I'm going to be changing the opacity. I'm just going to go ahead and just hit it in spots until it's where I want it and it has a nice curved look to it. I might just go ahead and just add a little more there. Back that out. Okay, let's go ahead and change the blend mode of this to multiply. That's a really good blend mode for shadows. It's going to darken it a little bit, but I'm going to drop the opacity back. And now we have a nice curved piece. Now it's really big, so it's not sitting on top of the notebook, so it's a little bit difficult to picture it yet, but once we start adding the hole as well as add it to the notebook, it's going to begin looking more and more like a binder ring. So the next thing I want to do is add the hole here. I'm going to go back to my designer side, and I'm going to make a square hole. I'm going to deselect that. I'm going to grab that kind of medium gray and just drag out, oops, drag out a square, and I want to make sure that it's on fill and not stroke. Now it's sitting on top of it, not a problem. I'm going to go ahead and just drag that down below the curve. And that might be a little bit too on the nose because that gray is really blending in. So let's go ahead and just drop the dark value of that. The easiest way to do that is to click on whichever one you want to change and just drag down from the Color Studio icon. So if I drag up and down, you can see that the light and dark value is changing. All right, that looks good. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, so I'll grab my move tool and just move it in. I don't want it to be too big. All right, so we have our first binder ring and the hole that it's going into. Let's go ahead and group these two together. And I'm going to make it smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and hold my finger down so that I keep my ratio. I'm actually going to hold 2 down so it goes in from the middle. And you can see because I turned on the scale with object that my blurs aren't acting funny. They're not suddenly becoming really large. I'm just gonna move this over here. We'll probably end up sizing down even more, but I wanna turn my notebook back on. Let me zoom in so you can see this. I'm just gonna keep sizing down until it's right where I want it. And you can change the size of your notebook too if you don't have enough room. That's not a problem. I'm gonna place my first one. And I like how that's looking. We might move that out just a little bit. I have the first one placed. Now I want to duplicate it. Go to my edit menu and duplicate it. I'm going to go to my transform studio, and now I want to use the Y position and just move it to where I want it. And sometimes it's a little bit touchy if snapping's on, so just go ahead and turn that off. Move it to the position you want it. Do not deselect it, because if you keep it selected and keep hitting duplicate, it's going to move it that exact same amount each time you duplicate it all the way down your notebook until you have the amount that you want. All right. I'm gonna go back to my layer studio. I just want to group all of these together. So I'm gonna tap on the first one, 2-finger tap on the last, group those together, and just make sure that it's placed where I want it. And if you turn snapping back on, it should tell you when it's in the middle. All right. Okay. This might be a little bit too wide, so let's go ahead and just make that a little more narrow. Move it out a little. Okay, so we have our notebook in place. This sketchbook is ready to go. We have our binder rings, our front and back cover. We have the pages, everything that gives it that depth and dimension, and our shadowing. Now all we need is an illustration. So all you need to do is go to your documents menu. You can do a place image. And if you've saved off a transparent PNG, you can just add it. So I have this cardinal illustration here that I saved off without a background, and I just placed it into the document. Again, I could go ahead and make changes to the texture, to the color of the notebook to suit whatever illustration I'm using in here. Put this on Facebook, Instagram, on my website. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're into digital journaling, you can create this same spiral ring as well as the background and use it as a fun background for your planner in GoodNotes or other annotation apps. So that's our tutorial. If you like this, I'd love it if you'd give it a thumbs up. If you want to follow along with my weekly tutorials, make sure to hit the subscribe button and notification, and that way you'll always know when there's a new tutorial out here. Now, I do have classes on Skillshare as well. In fact, this particular illustration is an upcoming Skillshare class. So if you want to follow along with my full classes, you can find the link to my Skillshare channel in the description below. Thanks so much for joining me, and happy creating.